We just thank our worship team so much for, like Eric said, just absolutely phenomenal how they lead us every single week. And as Eric said, we're right sort of in the beginnings of our new series that we're doing in sort of correlation to our Kids Jam. So this year, as you can see, is the Lego theme. And we're talking about how God builds, how God develops and cultivates certain qualities and characteristics in our life that we absolutely need to become the people that we all have the potential to be. And so, over the next few weeks, we're going to talk about how God, He's the one who's responsible for growing our church, building up our church. He is the architect of our salvation. You know, we're saved by grace through faith in Him. He is the designer of our heavenly home, our eternity, where we're going to spend forever with Him. And last week I talked about how God builds our humility. We went to Genesis chapter 11. We talked about the infamous story of the Tower of Babel. And we talked about two things, really. One, the problem of pride, and how God then confronts that pride and develops or cultivates humility in our life. So if you missed that message, go back, go online, and you can watch that. It's on our YouTube channel, so you can watch that this week and catch up. But I also left you with a little bit of a homework assignment last week. Last week's message sort of, it came to an end before I had everything I needed to say said, and so we just had to stop. And that happens sometimes. But I sent you home with a series of about 6 different scriptures and some blessings or benefits that come from being humble people. And so I hope that maybe you spent some time with God this week and allowed Him to speak to you through those scriptures and just encourage you this week. And so this week, today, we're going to jump ahead in time a little bit, and we're going to talk about how God cultivates and builds obedience in our life. And we're going to talk about that from a story in a guy's life named Abraham. Abraham comes on the biblical scene in Genesis chapter 12, right after we read about the Tower of Babel. Genesis chapter 12, here comes Abraham on the scene. And God speaks to this man and He says, Abraham, I have chosen you. Now just imagine, God were to confront you and to say, I've chosen, out of all of the people on the earth, I've chosen you for a special assignment. He said, Abraham, I've chosen you to be the father of a great nation. This is my promise to you. You will be the founder and father of a great nation. And could you imagine the feeling that Abraham might have had? I mean, that's a blessing. God is going to use me and in such a unique but yet great way. Man, I can only just begin to think about how he may have felt. But there's one problem. Abraham, when God speaks to him and tells him, I've chosen you to be the father of a great nation, he has no children. So that sort of creates some issues, don't it? I mean, if you're going to be a father of a great nation, it starts with children. I have none. And so maybe you're thinking, okay, well, that's no big problem. Okay, maybe Abraham was a young guy. He's a strapping young guy. He's got plenty of time for he and his wife to have as many children as they need to have. It's all good. Well, it's not really like that. If you read Abraham's story, you find out that when God spoke to Abraham and gave him this promise, he's a strapping 75-year-old. His wife, a bit younger, 65. I don't know where you might fall within those categories, but could you imagine? You've never had any children, and at 75 and at 65, somebody brings up the topic of expanding the family, growing the family. It's like, no, we sort of let go of that dream a long time ago, right? And so we give God His credit. We say, okay, nothing is impossible with God. He can do whatever He wants with anyone He wants. And so as the story goes, Abraham and Sarah, they turn up pregnant. She has children, and they live happily ever after, and all of God's dreams come true. Well, it's not exactly like that either. Because after this promise, get this, 10 years go by and nothing happens. 10 years. They try everything, anything that they can imagine, that they've even, old wives' tales, whatever, to help them become a family. Nothing works. I mean, if in vitro would have been popular back then, if it would even be an option, they would have taken it. Like, let's do that, right? But nothing worked. And so they resorted to the only option that they felt they had left. And this sounds crazy, but this is what happened. Sarah had a maidservant, a woman by the name of Hagar. She says, I'm going to give Hagar to my husband as another wife, a second wife. Maybe through her I can have children. Abraham takes Hagar as his wife, sleeps with her, and lo and behold, she becomes pregnant. And at 86 years old, Abraham, through Hagar, has his first son. His name is Ishmael. And now 13 years later, Abraham's 99, and God comes for another little visit. They have a conversation. Now I'm going to give you the Cliff Note, shortened, abbreviated version. God basically says, Abraham, I see what you did there with the whole Hagar thing. And I know you had good intentions, and it seemed like a really good idea at the time. But man, you got things wrong. I mean, you really got things backwards. You see, when I said I was going to bless you and give you a son and turn you into a great nation, I assumed that you realized and understood that that would be through your wife, Sarah, not through some other woman. But since you didn't get the memo, and I'm a forgiving and loving and gracious God, here's what I'm going to do for you. Because Ishmael is indeed your son, I will bless him. I'm going to do mighty things in his life. However, the promise as I originally stated stands. I will make you into a great nation through Sarah. He sort of left it at that. And we have recorded for us 2 occasions of a conversation like that. Genesis chapter 17 and chapter 18. Maybe you'll take some time this week and read those. And in both instances, Abraham and his wife have the same response to God's idea of having children at such a late stage and age in their life. They laugh about it. Exactly, that's it. You got it. Like most of us. It's laughable. Like, are you serious? And we can all understand. We get it. They're probably thinking, okay, God, you're hilarious. I mean, 25 years ago, you said that you were going to use me to be the father of a great nation. 25 years. And nothing's happened except for the fact that I've had a son by the wrong woman. And so here you come to me now and say, oh, well, I'm still going to do it now. Like, trust me, Abraham, it's coming. Just hold on a little longer. Well, how long do I have to wait? Like, what is this all about? Is this going to take another 25 years? And then you're going to come back and say, well, just a little longer. It's like, what's up with that? So we get that. We can understand maybe how he's feeling. God's response was, well, he says, okay, so you think I'm funny. Like, you see me as a comedian now, right? Here's what I'm going to tell you. Here's what's going to happen. A year from now, you're going to have a son through Sarah, and we'll see who gets the last laugh. And I'll be danged if it didn't happen. It did. A year later, here comes a son through Sarah. And for those of you who've heard and happen to know this story, you remember what his name was? Isaac? Yeah. Do you know what Isaac means? he laughs. It's like a constant reminder. God says, I always get the last laugh. Don't think it's so funny now, do you? Right? And it starts to look like things are just coming together. Like finally, the stars are aligning. Everything's going right in Abraham's life. And if we could just map out the rest of this story, Abraham has Isaac. Isaac grows up, gets married, has children. His children have children, and their children have children, so on and so forth, and down through the ages and generations, becomes this great nation, and they all live happily ever after, and it's awesome. Well, that seems to be the plan, and that seems to be the direction things are going until you hit Genesis chapter 22. And that's where we're going to camp out today. Genesis chapter 22. We're going to be looking at the first 18 verses, but I just want to read verse 1 and 2 just to set the stage. Why this plan, at least seems, it came to a screeching halt. Genesis 22 verse 1 says, sometime later God tested Abraham. He said to him, Abraham, here I am. He replied. Then God said, take your son, your only son, whom you love, Isaac. Now, wait a minute. Now, this is a little rabbit trail that I'm not going to follow. I just want you to think about it. Is Isaac his only son? No. So it's interesting that God is referring to him that way. So that's a whole other message for another day. But think on that a little bit. Chew on it and allow God to teach you something this week. It's very interesting. But we're just going to sort of try to put it in the back of our minds for this morning. He says, take your son, your only son, whom you love, Isaac, and go to the region of Moriah, sacrifice him there as a burnt offering on a mountain I will show you. Did I just hear you correctly, God? Like, things just really got complicated. God tests Abraham. Now, it shouldn't come to us as any shock that God would test us. I think God tests all of us in some form or fashion. But this is a test on a whole nother level. I want you to take your son, the son through whom I have promised there to come a great nation, and kill him. Sacrifice him as a burnt offering. Now, the rest of the story answers the question, will Abraham obey? Will he go through with this? So that's the question. How strong is his faith would be another way to put it. Because, see, faith and obedience are like two sides to the same coin. You can't have one without the other. They go hand in hand. They complement each other. Obedience is the product and a reflection of our faith. If we have very little faith, then we're likely going to obey God very little. If our life is marked by great faith, then we're probably also going to notice great obedience. You see what I'm saying? James chapter 2, verse 17, James said that faith without works, faith without deeds or actions, in other words, faith without obedience, is dead faith. It's no good because you cannot have one without the other. Now, we like to suggest that you can. And we all like to make out as if we do. I've got great faith. James would say, show me your obedience. For example, we might say, well, I have a lot of faith. I trust God with, maybe it's finances. I trust God in my finances with money. But we don't obey Him in tithe. We don't obey Him and live generous lives. See, those two things don't complement each other. Or we'll say something like, well, I trust God with my children's lives and my children's future. That He will work in them and they will become everything that He wants and created them to be. But then as parents, we tend to try and plan every minor detail of our children's lives and their future. So really, where's our faith? Or for the younger crowd, I trust and believe, God, that He's going to bring into my life the right person. Mr. Right, Mrs. Right, and so I trust Him. I have faith that He's going to do that. And then turn around and date every loser that crosses your path. Come on. I mean, that's just the way it is. Our obedience doesn't match our faith. Our faith doesn't match our obedience. I don't really know what initiated the test of Abraham's obedience. I have a theory, but again, it's just a theory. But let's just say that Abraham had reached a point in his life where even though things were taking a lot longer than he thought they should or would have, he was okay with it. And he was saying things like, God, I trust you. I believe you can do anything. In your time, things are going to work out just as you have planned. Whatever you want me to do, wherever you want me to go, I'll do it. You just say the word. I have faith. So let's just say that's where Abraham is. Genesis 22 would be God's response saying, okay, let's test that. Let's see. Because the only way you can grow and build obedience is to test it. It's like a muscle. The only way to grow it is to put it under some strain. And sometimes that can be painful. And so what are some ways that we might find God testing our obedience? We're saying, God, I'll do whatever, go whatever. How is God going to really prove that and test that in our lives? We'll go back to Genesis 22. Pick up again in verse 2 and read down through verse 10. I think we're going to find at least 3 ways that God might do this. So follow along with me. Verse 2, he said, Then God said, Take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the region of Moriah. Sacrifice him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains I will tell you about. Early the next morning, Abraham got up and saddled his donkey. He took with him 2 of his servants and his son Isaac. When he had cut enough wood for the burnt offering, he set out for the place God had told him about. On the 3rd day, Abraham looked up and he saw the place in the distance. And he said to his servants, Stay here with the donkey while I and the boy go over there. We're going to worship and then we'll come back to you. Abraham took the wood for the burnt offering and he placed it on his son Isaac, and he himself carried the fire and the knife. As the 2 of them went on together, Isaac spoke up and said to his father Abraham, Father? Yes, my son, Abraham replied. Well, the fire and the wood are here, Isaac said, but where's the lamb for the burnt offering? Abraham answered, God himself will provide the lamb for the burnt offering, my son. And the 2 of them went on together. When they reached the place God had told him about, Abraham built an altar there and arranged the wood on it. He bound his son Isaac and laid him on the altar, on top of the wood. Then he reached out his hand and took the knife to slay his son. Now we're just going to stop right there for a minute because, like I said, I think there's at least 3 ways here in which we might discover God testing our obedience. And the first one is God may remove what we value most. In order to really see if we're serious about doing what He's called and is asking us to do, He may remove from our life what we value most. The entire promise from God to Abraham rests in the life of his son Isaac. Isaac is everything to him. He's his whole world. Isaac is Abraham's legacy. If Abraham is going to be the father of a great nation, if he's going to be the father of anything, the key is his son Isaac. So what happens? What happens to the promise? What happens to the goals? What happens to the dreams if you take Isaac out of the equation? If you remove him? I'm sure maybe Abraham was thinking, how is this going to work? If it's supposed to be through Isaac and I do this, can God still? Will God still? Have I made God angry have I done something wrong and God has changed his mind? And is that why this is happening? So there's a lot of questions. God tells Abraham, in order to go any further in this plan of mine, the plan I have set for you, you need to let go of what you value the most. I'm not saying it's so, but perhaps Isaac had become in Abraham's life somewhat of an idol. Perhaps Abraham was looking to Isaac, and there was more hope, there was more confidence, there was more faith in Isaac's ability to fulfill the promise than there was in the God who gave it. He said it happens to us sometimes. We begin to put more hope, more trust, more confidence in the things and the people that we value the most, more so than we do in God who gave them to us. And in order to test our obedience, if we're really serious about following Him where He leads, be it temporarily or sometimes permanently, He may say, you need to give that right there up. You need to let go of that. Remove what's valued most. Number two, God may require what is virtually impossible, what we think we absolutely cannot do. That's outside the realm of possibility. Because you see, if the idea of God requiring a man to sacrifice his son seems crazy to you, well, there's good reason for that, because it's crazy. Like, that's insane. Abraham did not know God in that way. This was not the kind of God that he believed in, that he believed he knew. Now, all of the pagan nations around them that he was used to living in community with, that was normal. Nothing unusual about families sacrificing their children in the fire in worship of their God. I mean, I know it's absolutely horrific to even think of that sort of thing. And so it's just outside of the realm of even the imaginable to think that Abraham would go through this. Even if he did, even if God were just absolutely dead set serious, like, this is going to happen, and you're going to do it, as a father, there's just no way. But put yourself in that position. There's just no way. That's one of those things, you look at that and you say, that's impossible. I can't do that. Matter of fact, I won't do it. I'm going to pack my stuff up and I'm going home. And I think as parents, we would probably all be able to empathize with that. Like, we would understand that. We might even give Abraham a pass on disobedience, because just as much as the birth of Isaac was laughable, now taking his life is unthinkable. And I know this is an extreme example, right? Because none of us have been asked to do such a thing. This is an extreme example. But have you ever sensed God calling you to do something that you thought was impossible? I just can't do that. I just don't see how that's going to work, how that plan is ever going to come together in a good way. I mean, just let me throw out a couple of examples. Maybe, and this could be somebody right now, maybe God has been leading you and directing you to quit your job, something that you've been doing maybe for 20 or 30 years. This is all you've ever known. Like, I started this kind of work out of high school, and I said, college is not for me, and I went into this trade. It's all I've ever done for the last 30 years, and now God's saying, give it up and do something different? I just don't know. Or maybe you're sort of later in your life, and this is supposed to be sort of like the golden years. You've got retirement in sight. Things ought to sort of be coming together and nice in a package wrapped up with a ribbon and all. This is that time of year or that time of season in your life, and God says, what I'd like for you to do is to go back to school, get some education in something else, and I've got another plan It's like, what? No. That's not the way this is supposed to be. Or God says, what I need you to do is to take that money that you've been saving, maybe for your vacation, or what if it were even for a child's college fund, and I need you to give it away. Oh, now, Lord, I'll do anything, but you ain't touching my money. Like, that's impossible. I can't do that. Or you've been in this relationship now for, what, 3, 4, maybe even 5 years? You've got marriage in sight. That's all you guys have been talking about. And God says, I need you to walk away from that relationship. That's not what I've got in store for you. That's not my best for you. God, I've got too much invested now. When He seems like He asks for what's just virtually impossible. You see, when everything makes sense and you can see how things are going to work out for the good, you still have that in sight, our obedience is usually still in play. When things are in the realm of possibility, even if they're on the edge, like teetering, it's going to be difficult, but I think God can pull it off. This can work. Most of us are still willing to obey. Are we willing to obey when something just goes right off the deep end, right off the cliff? And it goes from possible to impossible. What then? The third thing that God might do is to reserve, to withhold, keep back vital information. This one is so aggravating. I'm just being real. It's just so frustrating. Why doesn't God just tell us everything right up front? Because what kind of test would that be? Right? What kind of test would that be if you knew the end from the beginning? So I don't know if you actually know the rest of the story. I'm assuming that many of you do, but let's just say you don't. You don't know the rest of the story. And I would stand here and say, God told Abraham, go sacrifice your son. Abraham went, but just at the last moment, he was overcome with emotion, he was overcome with love, and even with anger and disgust for what God was asking him to do, that he just threw his knife on the ground and he says, I quit, I'm not doing this, this is absolutely unthinkable. And he grabs his son and he walks off the mountain. End of story. I had to be honest with you, I was like, I'm okay with that. I can see that. Because that's probably what I would do. I'm okay with that. Let's give him a pass. That's not the way things worked out. We're going to read it in a minute. But even if they did, when the dust settles, you know what we're left with? A man who said, God, I will do anything, go anywhere. I will obey you at any cost, but. You see, that don't work. That one 3-letter word voids the previous. We cannot say, God, I trust you, but. God, I have faith in you, but. God, I believe you will provide, but. Can't happen. Those two things don't mix. Here's what actually happened. We stopped off at verse 10. Abraham has his knife in his hand. He's about to slay his son when he hears somebody, stop! Verse 11. But the angel of the Lord called out from heaven, Abraham, Abraham. Here I am, he replied. It's like, phew. Don't lay a hand on the boy, he said. Don't do anything to him. Now I know that you fear God because you've not withheld from me your son, your only son. Abraham looked up, and there in a thicket he saw a ram caught by its horns. He went over and took the ram and sacrificed it as a burnt offering instead of his son. So Abraham called that place, the Lord will provide. And to this day it's said, on the mountain of the Lord it will be provided. The angel of the Lord called to Abraham from heaven a second time and said, I swear by myself, declares the Lord, that because you've done this and have not withheld your son, your only son, I will surely bless you, and make your descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky and as the sand on the seashore. Your descendants will take possession of the cities of their enemies, and through your offspring, all nations on earth will be blessed because you've obeyed me. You see, God had something other than the sacrifice of Isaac in mind the whole time. He just didn't tell Abraham about it. He didn't let him in on that vital information. But see, that's the test. It wouldn't have been a test if God would have said, Abraham, I want you to take your son up this mountain that I'm going to show you, and I want you to sacrifice him, but not really. Because at the very last moment, you see, I'm going to miraculously provide a ram that you're going to sacrifice instead. I was like, no problem. I mean, let's go. That's not obedience. When we have all of the questions answered, when we know the end from the beginning, we know the outcome, that's no test. But when God withholds certain information, when He reserves what we would consider like situational, transformational kind of information, so that's different. I don't know, you might be familiar with some of these scenarios. I can relate to that. Because there's been some times in my life where it's like, I don't think God's telling me everything here. I sense God leading in this direction, but what about this? And what if that? Or you might be familiar with God saying, I need you to do this. I'm going to move you forward in life, but first, you need to give up this. You need to let go of that, and whatever that is extremely important to you. Or God is saying, I need you to go here, and you're saying, there is not an option. Like, I can't do that. So how do we obey? How can we pass the obedience test? If we go back and look at this story, I think some of the actions of Abraham sort of guide us and will help teach us. And the first thing is, if we're going to pass the obedience test, we need to do like Abraham and keep looking up. Keep looking up. On two occasions here in this story, verse 4 and verse 13, we're told that Abraham looks up. Both instances are pivotal moments in the story. In verse 4, Abraham and Isaac, the servants, they've been traveling for 3 days on nothing but God's command to go to a certain region. He says, I want you to go to the region of Moriah. Now, how big's a region? I don't know. A few miles? A few hundred miles? Who knows? I just want you to go, so this is it, in the vicinity of. That's not very specific. That's not much to go on. How long is that going to take? And when I get there, when I finally reach the vicinity of wherever it is you're taking me, what then? Are we going to go a few miles more? Or are you going to tell me to go another 100 or 2? He just doesn't know. But what he does do is he keeps looking up. They've been traveling for 3 days. They're not sure where the final destination is really going to be. I'm sure they're exhausted, they're tired, they're frustrated. It's hot, I'm just using imagination here. And they may be thinking, I can't go one more step. I don't know how much more we've got left in the tank here. And in verse 4 it says, on the 3rd day, Abraham looked up and he saw the place in the distance. He looked up and he saw it. The end is in sight. The other instance was down in verse 13. Abraham has his knife in his hand. He has it raised, about to slay his son. When he hears that scream, stop, don't do this, Abraham, no. In verse 13, Abraham looked up, and there in the thicket he saw a ram caught by its horns, and he went over and he took the ram and he sacrificed it as a burnt offering instead of his son. See, the moral of the story here is, just when you think You can't go any further. Just when you think all hope is lost, just keep looking up. Keep looking up. Keep looking to God for strength. Keep looking to Him for hope. Keep looking to Him for clarity. Because you see, the region, right? The region, and ultimately the mountain that God would lead Abraham to, that he kept looking to, was Mount Moriah. Mount Moriah is where later on God would instruct David's son, King Solomon, to build the temple. The temple is where God said, "My name will dwell." This is the most holy site in Jewish life, Mount Moriah. It's where the Dome of the Rock stands right this very moment. It's the holiest site in the Islamic religion. This is that place. It represented God's presence among His people. He says, and every time you get down and every time you're struggling, you just keep looking up. Keep your eyes on me. Number 2, move according to God's direction. Something we need to remember about obedience is this. We're not held accountable to obey information and direction that we don't have. Right? We can't obey instruction that we haven't been given. So Abraham, he just keeps doing what he knows God said to do. He knows God said, set out and go in this general direction, so he went. When he got close after 3 days, he looked up and God delivered to him a message. He says, this is a particular place I want you to go to. He moved in that direction. When he got to the base of the mountain, the only information he had was go up this mountain and there sacrifice your son. He went up the mountain. He kept looking up. He went up the mountain. He bound his son. He laid him on the altar. He raised his knife to slay his own son. But he's still looking up because he heard a rustle. He heard something in the thicket. He looked up and he saw a ram. God provided. Jehovah Jireh has provided. And he moves that direction. He takes that ram and he sacrifices it instead of his son. Keep looking up. Keep moving in God's direction. And what you'll find is that you'll discover God's greater plan. So that's what it's all about. In obedience, it's a search to discover God's greater plan. Like, what's God doing here that is bigger than what I can understand or see at the moment? See, Abraham arrives and this alternative sacrifice is providing, and God says, it's now confirmed, Abraham. Like, you're serious. Like, your faith and your obedience, your determination is rock solid, man. But here's what I need you to know. This ain't about just you. You see, everything that you've been experiencing over these last few days, it's about something much, much greater. If you'll read through Genesis chapter 22, you'll find that everything that Abraham experienced was symbolic of something greater. You see, we get all hung up. We get all focused in on the fact that God really did ask a man to go and sacrifice his son. Let's not try to downplay that. He did. But we forget the fact that God didn't ask Abraham to do something that he wasn't going to do himself. You see, 2,000 years later, God himself, in this very same region, would sacrifice his own son, Jesus, a descendant of Abraham, on the cross for our sin, for mine and for yours. Just like Isaac, the wood, the cross was laid on the back of Jesus, and he carried it up that hill where he became the sacrifice. See, for Isaac, there was a substitute, because to sacrifice Isaac would have been unacceptable. That's not God's nature. That's not what God provides. That's why there was a ram. That's why the ram was caught by its horns and not by its body, because God requires a spotless, a blemish-free, no bruises kind of a sacrifice. The ram was caught in its horns, so its body would not be cut, bruised, and torn. But for Jesus, there was no substitute, because He is the only one in whom there was found to be no sin. He was the Lamb of God, and He would give His life for the sin of the world. See, there's so much there for God to teach us. I hope you'll spend some time and read it this week. But basically what we see in Genesis 22, one ram died and blessed one man and saved one's life. Through Jesus, one lamb died, blesses all, and saves whoever will come. What a powerful story of obedience. See, there's times when our obedience has to be tested. It has to be built up so that, like Abraham, we can experience the blessing of being a part of something greater. Now, I want to tell you just sort of how this story, for me, and this message, got extremely real this week. Everything came to a head. As you know, Jessica and I have been on sabbatical for 12 weeks, and we've been back at the church now for about a month. When you come back off of a break, knowing that over the 12 weeks you were gone, that attendance and giving and all sorts of just morale suffered, like we have the numbers, 20 to 25%. That's hard to take. And I take that personally. And then you come back in the middle of the summer where at no fault to anyone, people take vacation. Hey, that's all good. Guess what? I got one in too. And if you have one planned, please go. Enjoy yourself. But when things are down, somebody like me, I begin looking and thinking, that's my fault. This is my load to carry, and if it's not going in the right direction, at least it's the way I would see it, then that's on me, right? And so I was sharing with my counselor this week just how Monday mornings, a lot of times, I'll just be honest with you, they're rough. I've described Mondays before as, after I preach and I give my heart and soul, Monday morning's like a holy hangover. It is. I'm just trying to recuperate and get through it. You add on top of that the struggles and the pressure that I feel I have to carry, it can get downright depressive. And so I sat in front of my counselor this week, and I just shared. I was out there, man. I shared with him what I was going to be preaching on this week, and just how things in general life was going in the church. And man, he had lots of words of encouragement for me, but he said, listen, what you have, what you've just shared with me, man, that's a good word. Like, that's good. That's a good message. He said, but I want to challenge you to do something. Because he assured me, listen, it's not all up to you. If you really believe that this is God's church, man, he's got it. You don't have to carry that burden. Here's what I would challenge you to do. Before Sunday, before you preach this message, just go somewhere, get away, and get alone with God, and just see what He has to say. And he said, I would suggest, if you have the time, like go to a mountain. You're preaching on a guy going to a mountain, go to a mountain. And you know what God did? He led me not to Mount Moriah, but to Mount Morrow. All right? Now, that's as close as we can have to a mountain anywhere in Stanley County. Mount Morrow. All right? Well, I set out Thursday morning to head toward Mount Morrow. And about halfway there, I was thinking, this is silly. Charles is much more of an emotional guy than I am. He's all in touch with his feelings. Sometimes I wonder if I even have any. I'm thinking, this is just silly. I'm going to go up here, and I'm probably going to waste an hour. I could be doing so many other things, but about halfway there, man, God met me right there in the car. And it was just like a flood. Like I had real tears. Screaming, and I'm thinking, what is wrong with me? You seen that movie? You're like, what are these things? God met me. He showed up right there in the car. I was thinking, I don't even really need to go any further because I know what's about to happen, and I'm okay with that. But it's as if God was saying, press on, press on. You need to go up this. So I did. I got up to the top of that mountain. And I sat there just overlooking God's creation. And God began to speak to me. He began to encourage me. I began to say things to God that I thought I'd never be able to say. Things like, God, if my pride, if my definition of success, if what I think a successful church looks like is getting in the way of what you want to do with me and with New Life Church, I will stab it right here, right now. It's not up to me. This is your church. And if you're asking me to give up the one thing that at many times I love the most, I'll stab it. I'll put a dagger in it right now and walk away. It was so freeing just to say it, because God finally said, now you're ready. Now you're ready. Because from this moment forward, I'm not bound to defining success as I see it, by how many people are in attendance, or by at what level is our giving. All of that's important. We track those things. We're still going to do that. But that's no longer going to define success for me. It's dead. Because you see, and this is something that Charles brought up. He said, your mentality, and probably the mentality of much of those in the church, is our pastor's finally back. Things can get back to normal. Things can get back to the way they were. And God is saying, no, they can't. No, they can't. If we want to see what God has in store for us, if we really believe that the best is yet to come, things can't go back to the way they used to be. Things have to change. Things will forever be different, because God is a God who says, I do all things new, not the same old same. That was one of the most powerful moments that I've had with God in a long time. And I want to challenge you this week, whether it's to go to Mount Morrow or wherever, just get along with God this week and say, Lord, is there anything in my life that's standing in the way of your promise? Is there anything in my life that's hindering me from being, doing, or going where it is you want me to go? And right now, I'll stab it. I will slay it for your glory. And be okay with that.